It was, by any local measure, an entirely ordinary Monday. The sun was threatening to emerge, but ultimately deferred to cloud cover. The bin lorry had made its rattling procession through Northgate Avenue at precisely 7:36 a.m., and Mrs. Ethel Gribshaw of Sycamore Drive had been the first to phone the police station to report strange goings-on with milk bottle placement. Nothing unusual then, until the meeting. The Flaxborough Parish Amenities Subcommittee gathered, as it always did on the third Monday of each month, in the back room of the library, beside a defunct card catalog and a permanently locked cupboard that might once have housed biscuit tins. At precisely 6 p.m., the chairman, Councillor Ronald Blee, struck his gavel, a pepper grinder appropriated for ceremonial purposes, and called the meeting to order. 8 members were present. 9 had been expected. The 9th was Mrs. Charity Pugh, recording secretary of the committee and guardian of its minutes. She was known for a severe bun, a fondness for syllables ending in tion, and a handwriting style described by one fellow committee member as militantly cursive. Her absence, therefore, was not merely noticeable, but unheard of. "Most unlike her," murmured Alderman Gribble, peering over the top of his horn-rimmed glasses. Even when her sister died, she still sent a note. "She was very particular about minutes," added Miss Penelope Chalm. "Said nothing moved society forward like consistent punctuation." A rustle of agreement followed. The group, sensing something was amiss but unwilling to pause the evening's agenda, a motion to replace the cemetery hedge with gravel, agreed that Mrs. Pugh's absence would be noted and that Mr. Allen of the Rotary could take temporary dictation. He, in turn, produced a golf pencil and a napkin and looked faintly unwell. The first true oddity did not come until the following morning, when Miss Blenkinsop, the library custodian, discovered the door to the back room still ajar. A stack of unfiled folders teetered perilously close to the edge of the parish filing cabinet. And most curiously of all, the committee minutes book, a thick ledger with a cracked brown spine and Charity Pugh's unmistakable flourishes, was lying face down on the floor beneath the radiator. It was damp and torn, and worse still, page 17, corresponding to the March meeting, had been removed. Not cleanly, but hurriedly, jagged across the top. Miss Blenkinsop, not a woman to leap to conclusions, but quite fond of leaning toward them, rang the police station and requested someone discreet with a calm manner and neat footwear. Sergeant Love took the call and, recognizing the precise parameters of such a request, passed it without comment to Inspector Purbright. Purbright arrived at the library 20 minutes later, mild of expression and neatly trousered. Miss Blenkinsop greeted him with the solemnity of one showing a family, heirloom cracked in transit. "I didn't touch anything," she said, motioning toward the ledger. "But I dusted around it. I can't not dust, you understand." "Entirely," Purbright said. "I'm told the committee secretary failed to attend last night's meeting." Mrs. Pugh, the most punctual woman, rather sharp on the subject of procedural decorum, if she'd been the type to run off, she'd have left an index, the ledger, retrieved and placed gingerly on a reading table, revealed nothing overtly alarming beyond the missing page, and a faint odor of lavender and printer's ink. Purbright examined the torn edge and said nothing for several long seconds. Then he placed a protective sheet over the book and turned to Miss Blenkinsop. "Would you happen to know where Mrs. Pugh lives?" "Oh, yes," she said at once. "Top of Potwell Lane. Corner house with the doily curtains. Hers is the only property on the block with both a trellis and a notice board." The corner house on Potwell Lane was indeed distinct. Neat garden, stoic gate, and a porch light that blinked twice before staying on, as if apologizing for drawing attention. There was no answer to the doorbell, nor to the knock. Sergeant Love, summoned for assistance, arrived with the keys recently provided by Mrs. Pugh's neighbor, who had kept a spare for emergencies and annual fig chutney drop-off. Inside, the house was tidy, faintly perfumed with rose talc, and, alarmingly, silent. It was Love who found her in the conservatory, seated in a rattan chair, a tartan blanket over her knees, and her spectacles in her lap. She was quite unmistakably dead. There were no signs of struggle, no sign of panic. A cold pot of tea sat at her elbow. A single sheet of paper, partially typed, remained in the carriage of the small Olympia typewriter on the table beside her. It read, "March minutes to be reviewed before the next meeting. Discussion of allotment allocations remains sensitive. Further clarification from..." The sentence trailed off. The typewriter had jammed at the letter B. By noon, the coroner had been notified. Initial findings suggested no immediate signs of trauma. No pills, no spills, no evidence of forced entry. And yet, as Purbright stood in the conservatory with hands loosely clasped, he said something very softly, almost to himself. "It's a tidy death, but not a peaceful one." Later, back at the station, Sergeant Love reread the torn minutes from a photocopy supplied by the council clerk. "March meeting," he said, frowning. "Item 6, revision of allotment plots. That doesn't seem terribly deadly." "Unless," murmured Purbright, "someone preferred it remain unrevised." Love looked up. "You think this was about a vegetable patch?" "I think," said Purbright, "we'd better find out who was meant to receive that clarification. And what precisely was meant to be clarified? A death that left no mark, a page torn but not burnt, and a village ledger suddenly incomplete. And somewhere between rhubarb and bureaucracy, a motive had taken root. By Tuesday morning, the news of Mrs. Charity Pugh's passing had not only reached the furthest corners of Flaxborough, but had also begun to sprout theories with the same eager tenacity as dandelions in the churchyard lawn. The Flaxborough Chronicle led with a headline of restrained alarm: "Parish Secretary dies amid document confusion," while letters to the editor began arriving within the hour, speculating, in order, that her death was the result of recent revisions to the town hall biscuit policy, insufficient heating in the conservatory, and, most darkly, inappropriate conduct among the allotment tenants' liaison group. At the station, Sergeant Love was halfway through a tepid scone and his second cup of tea when Purbright stepped in, gently shaking rain from his coat sleeves. "She was typing something," Purbright said without preamble. "Minutes from the March meeting. It appears she never finished them." Love nodded. "I asked the committee secretary's stand-in, Mr. Allen, to bring in his own notes from the meeting. He's arriving this morning. Apparently he used the back of a bingo card and a napkin." "Then let's hope the napkin is legible," murmured Purbright. Mr. Allen, when he did arrive, carried a manila folder under one arm and had the manner of a man who has recently learned the hard way that improvisation is not universally welcomed in municipal contexts. "I'll admit," he said as he sat, "I didn't expect to be taking minutes, and I certainly didn't expect them to be of interest to the police. I assumed Miss Pugh was immortal in the bureaucratic sense." "Your notes from the March meeting?" Purbright asked. "Yes, well, they're a little unorthodox. Some of it's shorthand, some of it's mnemonics." Love glanced at the napkin. "This line here, B. Reggie frowns at patch 3A, quote, trowel tempers." Mr. Allen colored slightly. "I believe that refers to Mr. Reginald Blenkinsop's objection to someone being moved to plot 3A. There had been a proposal to reallocate it. something about sunlight and water access, and he became rather vocal. Something about a history of trowel theft. History? Purbright asked. 2 summers ago, a small dispute. Someone's name was scrawled onto someone else's fork. Purbright accepted the napkin and bingo card, flipping them with care. Was anything decided during that meeting? Miss Pugh said she would follow up privately with the parties involved. She preferred matters of horticultural dispute be resolved in writing. She tore out that page, Purbright said softly. Yes, page 17. That's where she'd begun drafting the March minutes. She mentioned she hadn't yet finalized the language and didn't want the draft left lying about. So she took the original with her? Love asked. Mr. Allen hesitated. Possibly, though it might have still been in the binder. She was always very precise about revisions, used to carry 3 kinds of ink. After he left, Purbright sat in quiet thought for several minutes before rising. We're going to visit Mr. Blenkinsop, the disgruntled trowel man. I suspect he has opinions to share. Blenkinsop, recently retired from the co-op grocery, lived on a narrow lane opposite the allotments, a fact which, to the consternation of several other gardeners, afforded him the opportunity to observe plant growth without so much as stepping outside. He opened the door in a mustard jumper and slippers that had outlived fashion, if not comfort. About time someone took an interest, he announced, waving them in. I said at the meeting it wasn't right. Giving 3 A's to someone new. Tradition, that's what it's about. I've tended those paths since they were turnip trenches in '49. You had a disagreement with Mrs. Pugh? Not her, no. She was fair, but she listened too much to certain voices. Which voices? Blenkinsop sniffed. Penelope Chalm, always fluttering her eyelashes at the chair. I want a rose arch and somewhere to plant bleeding hearts. Never trusted a flower that names its own trauma. And was Miss Chalm meant to receive Plot 3A? She put in for it, but I don't think it has been decided. Miss Pugh was due to confirm. Said she'd be consulting previous minutes and fairness agreements. Was anyone else upset by the pending changes? Blenkinsop scratched his head. Maybe Horace Pusey. He'd wanted to put in a greenhouse, and 3A gets the morning light. He's a quiet one, though. Keeps to himself mostly. Bit too proud of his marrow, if you ask me. Love jotted a note, frowning slightly. Do you think anyone would have tried to pressure Miss Pugh? Oh, they all try, said Blenkinsop with a smirk. But she wasn't scared. She had the look of someone who remembered everything and could produce it typed and annotated. As they left, Purbright turned once more to look across the muddy plots of the Flaxborough Allotment Association. Even in the gentle rain, figures could be seen. Waterproofed, wellied, and engaged in the eternal, mostly polite turf wars of community gardening. Back at the station, a package awaited them. Brown paper, hand-delivered, unsigned. Inside, a single page. Torn, with a jagged top edge. On it, faint typewritten text. March allotment discussion. Plot 3A remains unresolved. Pending review of prior agreements. Recommendation to maintain historical continuity, unless... The rest was smudged. The lower corner is damp, as though once set down beside a pot of tea. Well, said Love. That looks like our missing page. Purbright nodded slowly. Which means someone had it, and has now returned it, or most of it. Why now? Because they've realized we're asking the right questions. And someone careful, wants us to think we're nearly done. Love gave him a sidelong glance. But we're not, are we? No, said Purbright. We've not even reached the marrow. The partially recovered page now lay beneath a thin sheet of protective acetate on Inspector Purbright's desk, its contents as delicate as the reputation of the committees it referenced. The bottom third, warped and faint, revealed only a few ghostly letters. The word "unless" standing alone at the torn edge like a warning never finished. If there had been more, it would now be lost to time or damp. Sergeant Love stood nearby, arms crossed and brows knitted. So someone had it, tore it out, then decided to return a piece. Why not the whole thing? Because a partial truth, said Purbright, can be more useful than a complete one. It suggests cooperation without surrender. He picked up the sheet, holding it briefly to the light. And it tells us something else. Mrs. Pugh had already typed part of her recommendation, but she hesitated. She left the clause hanging, unless. Unless what? It suggests she was reconsidering, or perhaps being asked to. Love paced. Blenkinsop made no bones about wanting the plot left alone. Pusey had ambitions for a greenhouse, and Miss Chom, well, she sounds decorative, which is precisely what some residents of Flaxborough find threatening, Purbright murmured. He reached into the filing cabinet and pulled out a copy of the March agenda, cross-referencing the typed extract. The minutes don't mention any vote. But that may be the point. If a decision was made behind closed doors, or meant to be slipped through, then a record of ambiguity might be more dangerous than a clear verdict. Love nodded slowly. And someone wanted to stop Mrs. Pugh before she wrote anything more definite. The theory gained weight that afternoon when Miss Penelope Chom herself arrived at the station, with her usual scent of powdered lilies and municipal resolve. Her cardigan was the shade of oatmeal that had given up, and she carried her handbag as though it contained both secrets and commemorative teaspoons. I heard, she began, that Charity's minutes have gone walkabout. I thought I ought to provide my recollection. Purbright gestured her to a chair. That's very helpful of you. I believe transparency, she said primly, is the backbone of subcommittees, even when they're undeserved. Love produced his notebook. You were in favor of reallocating Plot 3, eh? I was in favor, she said crisply, of orderly beautification. That particular plot had grown wild, a tragic abundance of beetroot and no symmetry. A little trellising, perhaps some rose supports. It could lift the tone. Did anyone object to that? She tilted her head. Reginald Blenkinsop, of course. He believes the Great War was won by mere will alone. And Horace Pusey. She hesitated. Horace is diligent. He has a transparent plastic tent, very clean, very modern, but not charming. No flowers. Purbright allowed her silence to continue just long enough to feel like a confession, then asked, Did you ever speak to Mrs. Pugh about your hopes for the plot? Certainly. I submitted a formal proposal. I have it here. She retrieved a folded document from her bag. It was typed, single-spaced, and headed, Floral Harmonization for the Eastern Allotment Quadrant. The tone was civil, the language florid. Near the bottom was a postscript, handwritten in violet ink. My dear Charity, I hope you will consider how long Beauty has waited for a seat at the table. Yours, P. Purbright read it twice. Did she respond? Not directly, but she smiled at me across the library that week. It was the sort of smile that says, I see your point, but shan't be hurried. Did she mention any hesitations? She did say she was checking something from last year's file. Old agreements. There was a clause about continuity, but I don't recall the phrasing. When she left, her scent lingered like an afterthought. Love sat back. So she nudged, but not hard. Still, that note. She was leaning on familiarity. Pugh was under pressure, Purbright said, lightly applied, but from several directions. He stood and walked to the pinboard where the names were slowly forming a neat triangle. Blenkinsop, Pusey, and Chom. 3 personalities, 3 desires for one plot. And in the middle, a secretary who preferred her minutes balanced and her decisions unambiguous. "Do we know who last saw her alive?" Love asked. "The coroner's estimation places her death between 4 and 6 p.m. The committee meeting was at 6, so some time beforehand. Her milk was still on the step, which suggests she'd been home all day. Visitors? None reported, but neighbors rarely notice the quiet sort." Love picked up the agenda again. "What about the chairman, Ronald Blee? He'd have had the final say, wouldn't he?" "He'd also have expected Mrs. Pugh to frame that final say to reflect favorably on his neutrality. We'll speak to him." They visited Councillor Blee in his office at the Town Hall Annex, a room filled with heritage plaques and one slightly sulky spider plant. He greeted them with his usual attempt at bonhomie, which resembled a tired handshake made audible. "Ah, the law. I wondered when I might see you." "Mr. Blee," Purbright said, "we're reviewing the March minutes. Mrs. Pugh died while drafting them." "A dreadful thing," he nodded solemnly. "Her teas were works of art, one of a kind." "You chaired that meeting," Love said. "Do you recall any tension over item 6? "Item 6? Oh, the allotments. A bit of a kerfuffle. Miss Chom was eager. Blenkinsop was blustery. Pusey sulked, the usual." "Was a decision reached?" Blee spread his hands. "We deferred. Or rather, I asked Mrs. Pugh to draft language that acknowledged discussion while not promising too much." "An intentional ambiguity?" Blee nodded. "Safer than an actual policy. Keep the peace." "And yet," Purbright said, "Mrs. Pugh's draft appears to stop mid-thought." "That would be just like her. She never liked incomplete certainty." "And if someone wanted her to learn a little?" Blee paused. "They should have done it carefully." Charity didn't respond to pressure, but she might have responded to disappointment. As they left, Love muttered, "That's the second time we've heard about the file from last year. Whatever's in that agreement might be the key." Purbright nodded. "And someone wanted to make sure she didn't find it, or that, if she did, she didn't write it down." Back at the station, Constable Piercy arrived with news. "Sir, you asked for any reports of unusual activity near Potwell Lane. A delivery boy, papers, says he saw someone at Mrs. Pugh's window the day she died. Said it looked like a visitor around 5 o'clock. Couldn't see clearly. Said the person who left in a hurry. Description? They said they were carrying something. A bag. Could have been a satchel." Purbright looked up. "Get me the committee list again, and the minutes from last spring. I want to know exactly what was agreed, and who would rather we didn't remember it." The previous year's spring minutes took some time. They had been filed under miscellaneous subcommittees, PZ, in a cabinet known to resist opening unless coaxed with a knee. Sergeant Love returned to the office, slightly flushed and muttering about bent rails and mislabeled folders. But he held aloft a slim sheaf of carbon copies clipped neatly together. The Parish Amenities Subcommittee's April session from the previous year. Purbright accepted them with the quiet reverence one might reserve for a long-lost recipe card. He read them slowly, scanning for anything that might have been forgotten or, more likely, quietly erased from collective memory. "There," he said finally, tapping the 3rd page. "Under any other business. It seems Miss Pugh recorded a note regarding Plot 3A after all." Love leaned over. The plot formerly under temporary reassignment, 3A, to be preserved in accordance with the 1968 usage agreement, pending formal petition for modification. He blinked. That's practically an incantation. It's also binding, said Purbright. It means the plot couldn't be reassigned without unanimous consent, which would complicate matters for anyone hoping to inherit it through charm or silent assumption. Chalm? Or Pusey? Or Blee, if he promised the spot to smooth a vote. But Miss Pugh had found the clause. She was going to mention it again in the March minutes, which would have made it very difficult to reallocate anything without a formal vote. Love sat back. So someone, maybe one of them, tried to change her mind. And when that didn't work, they decided to intervene before her clarifications became part of the permanent record. That afternoon, Constable Piercy returned with a name. The delivery boy, after some persuasion involving a cream bun and a map, had recalled something else. The bag carried by the unknown visitor to Mrs. Pugh's house had a stitched monogram. F.P. Love looked up from his notes. That has to be Felicity Pusey, Pusey's niece. She's a solicitor's clerk, handles small claims and forms for her uncle. Which makes her unusually familiar with agreements, said Purbright. And quite possibly the only one who knew exactly how binding that 1968 clause still was. She was found at her desk in Pusey and Marsh, legal services, domestic and light agricultural. The office smelt faintly of damp paper and radiator dust, and Felicity Pusey looked up from a typewriter with the stiff professionalism of someone who had just heard footsteps approaching her conscience. "Inspector," she said, "is something the matter? You visited Mrs. Pugh on Monday afternoon." There was the faintest pause. Briefly, "You didn't mention it in your statement." "I didn't realize it was relevant. I was returning some correspondence. Uncle Horace had asked me to bring her a revised copy of the proposed layout for the eastern quadrant of the allotments. Plot 3A. Her jaw tensed. It was an administrative visit. You were seen leaving in a hurry. I didn't expect her to disagree so forcefully. She said she'd already found a clause that would make the new arrangement awkward. She was planning to add it to the new minutes. What did you say?" Felicity's fingers curled against the edge of the desk. That perhaps she was overinterpreting an old procedural footnote, that the council might prefer something less tangled. And did she agree? She was very calm. She told me the minutes were not for embellishment. They were a matter of record. Did you threaten her? Felicity went pale. Of course not. But you were carrying the revised plan. She hesitated. I left it with her. Was that the only copy? Another pause. There may have been one other. Purbright watched her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Thank you, Miss Pusey. You've been very helpful. Back at the station, Love leaned against the doorframe. So she's the last known person to see Mrs. Pugh alive, and she admits trying to dissuade her. But she also insists she left the house with the matter unresolved, said Purbright. And if she's lying, it's an awkward lie. Too tidy, too calm. No fingerprints on the kettle, no evidence of anything but conversation. Love frowned. But what if she didn't act alone? Purbright turned to the pin board, where the lines connecting names now resembled a misplayed game of drafts. That's the question. If someone else knew Mrs. Pugh had found the 1968 clause, they might have reason to act independently or hasten a plan already in motion. He tapped one name, Horace Pusey. We'll speak to him tomorrow, but before that, I'd like to visit the allotment. Love blinked, Now, in the fading light, that's when things become clearer. The allotments, though damp from intermittent drizzle, were still faintly alive with late-evening tinkerers. One or two figures moved among sheds and cold frames, hunched and hooded like monks of mulch. Plot 3A sat squarely near the middle, hemmed in by chicken wire and clumps of overgrown mint. A small wooden stake had been freshly driven into the corner, a laminated sign flapping limply against it. Pending reassignment, not in use. Purbright stepped across the path and bent beside the shed door, brushing aside a spray of moss. He opened the latch. Inside, amidst trowels, gloves, and a tin of slug pellets, was a rolled tube of paper, sealed with an elastic band. He unrolled it. The proposed Eastern Quadrant layout, revised, reassigned, with annotations in red pencil, to be submitted following pew confirmation. Chairman aware. Love's breath was audible behind him. So Blee was in on it. Purbright said nothing, but as he tucked the plan into his coat and looked toward the horizon, a sliver of cold pink cutting through the mist, his eyes narrowed just slightly. "It seems," he said, "that someone had already written the future. They were just waiting for Charity to sign the bottom of it." The soft patter of rain, which seemed to hush the town into a kind of expectant silence, accompanied Inspector Purbright's return to the police station. In his office, the lamplight pooled around the rolled allotment plan as he unrolled it again, his fingers smoothing the creases like a man handling old grievances. Sergeant Love sat across from him, chewing thoughtfully on the end of a pencil. "There's no signature," Love said, tapping the margin of the document. "But if this is the same version Felicity Pusey left with Mrs. Pugh, it means someone else retrieved it after her visit." "Or placed it," Purbright murmured, possibly to imply an agreement that never occurred. "Forgery? Perhaps, or premature optimism." He leaned back. "Either way, the presence of this plan in the shed, not in Mrs. Pugh's house, is curious. She was meticulous. She would have stored it with her other correspondence." "You think someone moved it?" "If they'd taken it from her home after the fact, they'd have risked being seen. But if they'd arrived early the next morning, before Constable Piercy and the tea tray, they could have removed any incriminating document and stashed it somewhere less associated with her." Love frowned. "But why hide it in the shed? Why not destroy it?" "Because the person who put it there still wanted the plan to go through. They just needed to nudge it past scrutiny. Once Mrs. Pugh was no longer able to object, the plan would seem to speak for her." Love exhaled slowly. So this wasn't just about silencing her. It was about faking her compliance. That evening, under the modest excuse of checking civic records, Purbright attended the weekly meeting of the Parish Amenities Subcommittee. Councillor Blee was present, flanked by the cheerfully oblivious Miss Rudge and the brooding presence of Horace Pusey, whose sour expression had become something of a local barometer for bureaucratic tension. The discussion, as expected, wandered through complaints about dog fouling, a disputed invoice for gooseberry netting, and a motion to repaint the bandstand before the summer brass competition. But when Blee raised the subject of Plot 3A, the room temperature changed. "A delicate matter," Blee said, folding his hands. "As you know, the unfortunate passing of Miss Pugh has left some administrative loose ends. However, as she was in receipt of the latest proposed plan—" "Was she?" Purbright asked mildly. Blee paused. "She received the revised layout via Miss Pusey, did she not?" Horace shifted in his chair, but said nothing. "She did," Purbright replied. "Though I wonder how many here are aware of what the 1968 agreement actually states." Miss Rudge blinked. Wasn't that the year we had the allotment bonfire incident? It was also the year a usage clause was written into the records, requiring full consent for reassignment of certain plots, including 3A. Blee coughed. Ancient history, surely not binding. Miss Pugh thought otherwise. She intended to raise the matter in the upcoming minutes. There was a brief, unmistakable silence, a kind of bureaucratic stillness in which no one quite dared speak for fear of being drawn into an implication. Unfortunately, Purbright continued, she never had the opportunity. Are you suggesting, Pusey said, finally finding his voice, that her death was not natural? I'm suggesting that some found her knowledge inconvenient. He let the silence settle again, then turned politely to Blee, who had access to the draft plan before it was printed. Blee dabbed his brow with a folded tissue. Several of us. It was discussed in a closed session. I had the final version reviewed by Mr. Pusey, and Miss Pusey typed and delivered it. Would anyone else have known what the clause meant? Horace Pusey gave a brief, scornful laugh. You assume most people read the footnotes, Inspector. You'd be mistaken. Miss Rudge raised a tentative hand. Charity did mention it, though. Just last week at the Women's Guild raffle. She said something about the old papers finally proving useful. And did anyone respond? She laughed at herself. I think she said, you'd be surprised what small things can keep large weeds from spreading. I assumed she meant the runner beans. Purbright inclined his head. Perhaps she did. The meeting ended without further drama, though Blee's exit was brisk, and Pusey remained seated long after the others had left, his gaze fixed on the floor. Back at the station, Purbright made a note. Miss Pugh referenced the 1968 clause publicly. No reaction observed then, but possibly enough to cause panic in those with plans dependent on its removal. Love looked over. So, which one do you think it was? Blee stood to gain influence, Pusey stood to preserve favor, and Felicity might have acted out of loyalty or pressure. But the true question, Sergeant, is which of them believed Charity Pugh wouldn't back down and decided to ensure she never had the chance. That night, in the tea shop window, a new sign appeared, temporarily closed for private memorial. Reopening Thursday. The town, of course, had thoughts. Some said it was a gesture of respect. Others whispered that a financial reckoning was being sorted behind the scenes. One claimed to have seen Miss Rudge carrying a box of unused raffle prizes inside, evidence, she claimed, of unspoken rearrangements. But no one could deny the sense of pause. The town felt temporarily quieter, not peaceful, but held in a breath, waiting for something to settle or be unearthed. The following morning brought with it a kind of dreary enthusiasm peculiar to Flaxborough when scandal hovered, tantalizingly unconfirmed, on the edge of public record. The rain had cleared, leaving the pavement slick and gleaming under a weak sun. Shopkeepers opened shutters with more animation than usual. There was speculation at the bakery, subdued but insistent chat in the post office queue, and an air of bated civility among the town's brass polishers, newsletter folders, and civic loyalists. At the station, Purbright stood at the filing cabinet with a list in one hand and a faintly sardonic smile on his lips. 4 unsigned witness statements, he said. 2 letters to the editor of the Flaxborough Chronicle quoting contradictory regulations, and 1 anonymous note left in our letterbox last night, folded inside a torn page from Gardner's World. Sergeant Love peered at the note. She knew, we all did. Ask about the shed, watch the minutes. He frowned, cryptic, and capitalized like a headline. Purbright hid it in the envelope. That particular handwriting, I suspect, belongs to someone with a fondness for purple ink and municipal italics. Miss Rudge? A safe guess. They made their way to the Pugh cottage shortly after 10, this time with a proper request for entry. Miss Rudge, as anticipated, fluttered behind them, not quite offering permission, but refusing to object. "I do think it all ought to be left in peace now," she said, hovering at the threshold like a fretful chaperone. Charity wouldn't have wanted a fuss. "Quite so," said Purbright, stepping inside. The sitting room had not changed since his first visit. Neat, orderly, and betraying little. The tea set still gleamed in the corner cabinet. Framed watercolors of modest hedgerows and indifferent sheep looked down with passive expressions. It was only when they entered the study that something new presented itself. On the desk, amid the usual envelopes and newsletters, lay an open envelope bearing the crest of the Borough Planning Office. It was addressed to Miss Pugh and postmarked 3 days before her death. Purbright opened it gently. Inside was a short covering letter and a single sheet. A copy of the proposed allotment development, marked draft, not for circulation. There was a note at the bottom, in thin biro. "Per discussion. Please advise." He showed it to Love. "This confirms she received a confidential copy earlier than we thought. This wasn't the version Felicity brought. This was earlier." Love narrowed his eyes. Then why didn't she mention it to anyone before the meeting? She wasn't shy. Perhaps she was verifying something. Purbright lifted the draft into the light. There, beside plot 3A, was a penciled margin note. Non-transferable unless a clause repealed. Check 1968. She knew, Purbright said softly, and she was already preparing to challenge it. That afternoon, at the Flaxborough Library, an event of modest chaos unfolded. The Historical Society had organized a public reading of extracts from Local Voices, an oral history of borough planning, 1946 to 1975. Curated, and, some suspected, heavily edited, by retired headmaster Edgar Frimpton. The reading was to be held in the reference room, with light refreshments in the map archive. Purbright arrived just as the first extract was being performed with uncertain theatricality by Mrs. Spink, who had brought her own bell to signify transitions in the text. Love hovered nearby, pretending to inspect a display of vintage drainage maps. Midway through a particularly impassioned recollection of a 1952 lawn reclassification, the peace was broken by a shrill exclamation from the archive room. "Good Lord, someone's tampered with the display case." It was Miss Pocknell, indignant and florally over-perfumed, pointing to the now empty space where the original 1968 Parish minutes had been displayed under glass. Frimpton hurried forward, appalled. "This is an outrage. They were here yesterday. I dusted them myself." "Gone," said Miss Pocknell. "Vanished. And I blamed lax supervision." The room erupted into a flurry of speculation, accusation, and not a little satisfaction that something had finally happened in the library. Purbright waited until the volume dipped, then cleared his throat. "Might I suggest," he said calmly, "that no one leaves the building just yet." 20 minutes later, the missing folder was discovered, stuffed hastily behind a radiator near the geography section. It had been tampered with. The binding strings were loose, one page was creased, and a single sheet, the one bearing the disputed clause about non-transferable allotment plots, was conspicuously missing. Purbright stared at the radiator in silence for a moment. Love, behind him, muttered, "Too public for panic." Someone realized they couldn't destroy it, but didn't have time to slip it away cleanly. "No," Purbright said. They wanted it to vanish, but also be found. It's not about hiding anymore. It's about confusing the record, making any version seem suspect. Outside, the society members were still muttering as the crowd dispersed, most concluding that the theft was either a student prank or, more likely, the inevitable result of council cutbacks. Only Miss Rudge stayed behind, nervously adjusting her handbag. "Inspector," she said in a tone both hopeful and resigned, "I suppose you think I'm being silly, but may I just say, Charity Pugh never lost things. Not ever. If she were here now, I think she'd say, well, when things go missing, it's usually because they're being replaced." Purbright nodded. "And what do you think is being replaced, Miss Rudge?" She hesitated, looked away, and whispered her objection. Back at the station, the recovered minutes were placed under lock and key. Purbright made 2 notes in his file. 1. Miss Pugh received an early draft, marked with a query about the 1968 clause. 2. Original minutes targeted, but not erased, just muddied. He leaned back and closed the folder. Outside, the first proper sunlight of the week was warming the stone of the town square. A group of pensioners was arguing genially about the relative merits of white currant jam. A seagull stole a sausage roll from a child and received a round of polite applause from a bus queue. Flaxborough, Purbright thought, had an exceptional gift for combining polite collapse with sustained appearances. Just the right kind of town, in other words, for someone to believe they could rewrite history and trust no one would check. It was precisely at 3:47 that afternoon, during an uninspired debate over street lamp refurbishment at the town hall subcommittee meeting, that the second scandal of the week erupted. Councillor Miss Rowena Clagstone, a woman of rigid beliefs and increasingly erratic syntax, had risen to voice objections concerning frivolous electrical enhancements. She had scarcely launched into her 8th subordinate clause when her handbag, resting innocently at her feet, emitted a curious metallic clatter followed by what witnesses later described as a sound like a chicken choking on a bell. Every head turned. The handbag, upended in its modest tweed sensibility, had produced, in addition to a large tin of barley sugar and a volume titled Civic Virtue for Widows, municipal tape recorder, battery-operated and very much running. The reel hissed, clicked, and then, with perfect clarity, the voice of the late Miss Charity Pugh issued forth. "And if Clagstone tries to move that vote again without checking clause 12.4, she deserves the audit." Gasps followed. The voice continued. "The council's forgotten its promise to freeze that allotment line. They'll try again in spring, mark me. Same weasel phrasing, same handshake behind the press release." Another voice interrupted, less distinct, male, perhaps belonging to one of the senior councilors. "But Charity, if they haven't got the minutes, they haven't got a leg to stand on, have they?" That was the moment chaos set in. Miss Clagstone turned crimson. The clerk dropped a tray of official forms, and one of the junior councilors was seen muttering, "Clause 12?" while flipping through a dog-eared binder with the panicked energy of a schoolboy in an unannounced exam. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, summoned discreetly by the committee secretary, who had phoned the station on the pretense of a minor disturbance, the recorder had been secured in an envelope. Miss Clagstone was being consoled with sweet tea, and the meeting had been adjourned indefinitely. Purbright entered with his usual quiet courtesy, nodded to those assembled, and gently took possession of the recorder. "Interesting accompaniment to the afternoon's minutes," he murmured. Clagstone was indignant. "I had no knowledge of that device, Inspector." Someone must have, she faltered, visibly struggling to find a verb that would suggest both intrusion and moral decay, without implying that she herself had left her bag unattended. I quite believe you, Purbright said. In fact, I wonder if it slipped in precisely because it would end up here. You mean to discredit me? Or distract us? He turned to Councillor Lembridge, a portly man whose trousers never seemed quite convinced of their purpose. Did Miss Pugh attend this committee regularly? Only when the agenda concerned allotments, Lembridge said, dabbing at his temple with a council-embossed napkin. Or licensing, or bin rotation, actually most weeks. And was she in the habit of recording meetings? Not to my knowledge. Though she did once bring a dictaphone to the Women's Guild AGM after a dispute about jam. Purbright raised an eyebrow. Do you recall any meeting recently where minutes were not fully recorded? There was silence. Then, slowly, Lembridge said, Now that you mention it, there was some confusion over the March file. Something about a misplaced folder. Later that evening, back at the station, Purbright and Love played the tape in full. Apart from the damning phrases heard earlier, the recording offered several other remarks, each more revealing in its mundanity than its content. There was a passing mention of a donation from a builder with eyes on Plot 4C. There was an offhand comment about fixing the voting order for the March meeting. And there was this. If anyone thought they could erase that clause without raising a finger from me, they were sorely mistaken. I've made sure my objections are heard one way or another. They can't rewrite the past and expect it to stay that way. Purbright switched off the machine. She knew, he said, and she made sure someone else would know too. Someone who found this tape planted it in Clagstone's bag and started the whole town talking again, Love said. But who? Someone who wanted the town to look at Clagstone, or the tape, instead of something else. Purbright rose, crossed to the window, and looked out at the gathering dusk. Below, a cluster of townspeople was congregating around the notice board, where someone, rather enterprisingly, had pinned a handwritten transcription of the Pugh tape, already embellished with editorial flourishes. He turned back. We need to speak to whoever found the tape. How will we know who that was? We won't, Purbright said, but they'll come to us. He tapped a pen lightly on the desk. Miss Rudge will bring them. Not by name, but I'm worried. The prediction proved sound. Just before closing time, Miss Rudge appeared, visibly flustered and holding a box of receipts. I don't mean to interfere, she said breathlessly, but I've just been to the church to collect some old parish bulletins, and someone had left a folder on the vestry chair, with Miss Pugh's name on it. She placed the box down. Inside were 7 sheets of carbon copy paper, each marked Draft, Minutes, March Committee Meeting. All appeared genuine, but when Love began to flip through them, Purbright stopped him. Number count the pages first. 7. Should be 8, Purbright said. Every other month has 8. They stared at the gap. A single page is missing, probably the one detailing the vote. The same one that was removed from the library copy? Purbright nodded. I think the game is no longer about deleting history. It's about replacing it with something conveniently confusing. He looked again at the tape recorder, the box of receipts, and the missing page. The question is, he said, who knew which details were on that missing page? And who stood to lose if anyone else found out? Outside, the bells from St. Ethel's began to ring. Purbright turned slowly, almost smiling. I believe we are about to be visited." The visitor arrived not with a flourish, but with the subdued embarrassment of someone who had delayed just long enough to feel both exposed and belated. Reverend Tibbins stood in the station's vestibule, hat in hand, lips pressed into an expression best described as ecclesiastically sheepish. Miss Rudge had announced him with a barely veiled smirk, then retreated hastily to rearrange filing drawers that had not required rearranging since decimalization. "I do hope I'm not intruding," Tibbins murmured, stepping into Purbright's office with the careful gait of a man who had once turned an ankle on a chancel step and never fully trusted floorboards since. "It's only... well, I fear I may have stumbled upon something I ought not to have touched." Purbright gestured to the chair opposite, which creaked obligingly. "Do tell us, Reverend." Tibbins cleared his throat, fingers dancing nervously across the brim of his hat. "Yesterday afternoon, during my usual sort of clearing up after the craft group, a most spirited meeting, you'll be pleased to know, involving several macaroni angels, I discovered a folder, brown and worn, with a municipal clip. I opened it, you see, to determine ownership. Naturally, Purbright agreed. I recognized Miss Pugh's handwriting. I thought it best to place it where someone of authority, yourself, of course, might see to it. So I asked Miss Rudge, though I may have exaggerated slightly and implied I was merely passing along the find rather than its finder. Why the hesitation?" Tibbins looked abashed. "One doesn't like to be mistaken for the sort of fellow who reads other people's files." "No," said Purbright gently, "but one does occasionally have to choose between discretion and civic duty." "I chose late," Tibbins said, and looked properly miserable. Purbright allowed a pause. "Did you notice anything else about the folder? Anything odd?" Tibbins thought, frowning. There was a faint smell of linseed oil. Love blinked. "Linseed? Yes. It reminded me of the vestry cupboard where the kneelers are repaired." "A joiner's shop, perhaps?" Love asked. "Or a painter's studio," Purbright said. "The kind where one makes a practice of keeping curious items under layers of canvas." "Or," added Tibbins, visibly brightening, "the janitor's cupboard at the Flaxborough Library. That's where Miss Pugh kept her filing box. The whole place reeked of polish and oil when she had a tidy up." That detail, small and earnest, caused Purbright to rise and retrieve the folder again. He leafed through the pages, each marked with Pugh's spidery annotations, until he reached the final sheet, a memo of procedural amendments. His eyes narrowed slightly. There, between two standard recommendations on town signage and hedge trimming, was a penciled note. "See revised motion on plot transfers. Inkle clause added 22nd of March. Copy forwarded to Brimley GL, not recorded in printed minutes." He handed the page to Love. "Does that name ring a bell?" "Brimley?" Love frowned. "Could that be Godfrey L. Brimley, former council auditor?" "Possibly. Retired 2 years ago. Moved to East Dilford." Purbright tapped the page. "But why send him a copy? And more to the point, why mention it here?" Miss Pugh, they were learning, had not merely been diligent. She had been meticulous in a way that veered into quiet defiance. She knew her minutes would be overlooked, amended, or reshaped. So she annotated her drafts as a secondary breadcrumb trail. The question now was, what had been in the missing page, and who wanted it removed? That evening brought the second set piece in Flaxborough's curious week of escalating municipal drama. It occurred not in council chambers or flower festivals, but in the sparsely attended monthly book auction at the Methodist Hall, where retired solicitor Harold Mapleridge caused an unexpected uproar. Mapleridge, a man whose legal opinions were now largely limited to fictional detectives and the occasional letter to the Times, had purchased a box of mixed volumes, mostly cookery and theologies. Midway through examining a tattered copy of St. Augustine's Confessions, he let out a startled yelp and dropped the book. Nestled inside was a folded carbon sheet, stained, creased, and clearly out of place. It was the missing 8th page. Pandemonium followed, at least by Flaxborough standards. The auction was halted. 2 people fainted, though one later admitted it was her hips rather than the drama. The sheet was whisked to the police station, where Purbright, upon seeing it, allowed himself the nearest thing he ever expressed to satisfaction. It was a record of the March vote. And more than that, it was proof of manipulation. The original version noted a 3-2 vote, blocking the transfer of certain unused allotment plots to a developer, one Leonard Sprott. Yet the amended version, which had made it into the final minutes, claimed the motion had passed unanimously. "That," said Love, "is deliberate falsification. And whoever did it assumed Miss Pugh would never notice, or at least not live to contradict it." Purbright said nothing. He was staring at the names of those listed in attendance. Miss Clagstone, of course, Councillor Lembridge, the deputy chair, and, incongruously, one name that stood out, not because it was suspicious, but because it wasn't meant to be there. B. Rudge. Miss Rudge had no official role on that committee, yet her name was listed as acting recorder. He turned the page, then again. The ink used on the original sheet matched Miss Pugh's usual biro, but the signature and the name was appended in pencil. Purbright folded the page and rose. "Miss Rudge is not responsible," he said calmly. "But someone wanted it to appear that she had access, or, more interestingly, that she might have copied something." "Trying to pin it on her?" Love asked. "Or test her loyalty," Purbright said. "She spent decades at that station, seen everything pass through her in tray. Too much trust can be dangerous, especially if you're the sort who thinks clerks should be loyal to institutions, not truth." The telephone rang. Miss Rudge's voice, oddly strained, came through. "Inspector, there's a visitor for you. She won't give a name, but she says you'll know her by her knitting." Purbright allowed himself a rare smile. "Send her in." The woman who stepped through the office doorway carried with her not only a large green knitting bag, but also the air of someone who had long been expecting and knew it. Her gait was firm and unhurried. A few errant wisps of gray hair clung to her coat collar like threads waiting to be tidied. She wore a tartan scarf pinched tightly at the neck and a pair of gloves that suggested both economy and style, neither new nor neglected. "Inspector," she said, "before we begin, may I ask whether you prefer plain truth or polite fiction?" Purbright rose courteously. "The truth, if it isn't too inconvenient." She nodded once. "Then I'll speak plainly. I believe I know who took that missing page, and I believe they wanted me to see it." Love, seated to one side with a notebook that had seen better days, paused mid-scribble. The woman set down her bag, unzipped it, and produced a tin of barley sweets before offering one to both officers. Neither was accepted, and she popped one into her own mouth as if to reinforce her point. "My name's Lillian Spragg, retired sub-registrar. I ran the East District Records Office until '89. After that, I did odds and ends for the council. Typing minutes, mostly. The sort of thing Miss Pugh used to do single-handedly, until they started asking her to train people like me." Love ventured. "So, you were close with Miss Pugh?" "We respected one another, which in local government is more binding than friendship, or pay for that matter. She adjusted her scarf, eyes narrowing behind thick spectacles. 2 weeks before she died, Annie told me someone had been going through her out trays, quietly, after hours. She didn't want to make a fuss, said it was probably just someone in a muddle. But then she found something missing, a draft motion on plot transfers. Said she'd make a clean copy for the archive and bury the original in plain sight. Which archive? Purbright asked. The Methodist book auction. Lillian allowed herself the smallest smile. She knew that sort of thing would be ignored by anyone genuinely criminal, but would burn the conscience of a dishonest counselor. And the copy sent to Brimley? She was hedging her bets. Love blinked. But that's a lot of effort for a note about a vote. Why not report it outright? Because, Sergeant, she said with deliberate patience, people like Annie didn't report things. They documented them, quietly, thoroughly. So when the time came, someone, maybe you, would see what they'd seen. Purbright nodded slowly. And the person who took the original page? Lillian reached into her knitting bag once more and retrieved a thin envelope. This arrived in my letterbox yesterday. No stamp, no postmark. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. Typed on an ancient machine, its keys clearly in need of servicing, were 6 words. You know what's missing. Tell him. Love looked at Purbright. Her? No, said Lillian. Someone who thinks I still carry influence in record-keeping circles, or that I might go to the police if nudged. Why now? Because the story's unraveling. Because someone panicked. That evening brought the 3rd set-piece scandal in as many days. A town council meeting that was meant to be routine, but devolved into farce before the 2nd item on the agenda. It began when Councillor Lembridge rose to suggest streamlining the allotment reassignment protocols, a phrase that, in Flaxborough, was immediately taken to mean some beloved cabbage patch was under threat. Within moments, murmurs filled the chamber. Mrs. Finch of the Allotment Society clutched her handbag like a bludgeon. A young man from the press, clearly overqualified for the assignment, began scribbling with real interest for the first time all night. Then Miss Rudge, from the back row, stood. I beg your pardon, she said, not loudly but with a force that carried. But I wonder if Councillor Lembridge would care to clarify whether his motion pertains to the same clause that Miss Pugh removed from the minutes, and which was later recovered from the vestry box. There was a silence so thick one could have planted carrots in it. Lembridge's face turned the color of a stewed beetroot. I don't believe that's inappropriate. I do, came another voice, this time from Reverend Tibbins, seated among the guests. I believe it's precisely the sort of question Miss Pugh would have asked. The meeting was suspended, not formally, but by the sheer weight of discomfort that swept through the chamber. People filed out slowly, whispering in new alliances. A few councillors lingered, stunned not by the accusation itself, but by the gall of having it spoken aloud. In the car back to the station, Love whistled. Well, that was something. Indeed, Purbright replied, gaze distant. What do you think tipped it? She was ready, Purbright said simply. She'd read the room, read the paper, and I imagine she'd also read the side of Lembridge we hadn't yet seen. Miss Rudge, it turned out, had once applied for the deputy clerkship and been quietly passed over. The reason, murmured at the time, was that she was too dependable. Now, her dependability has become inconvenient. But instead of brooding, she had waited for the right moment to speak, and she had chosen it with the precision of a veteran stenographer. That night, Purbright sat at his desk with the original page before him, now pinned beside the amended minutes. Side by side, they told a story not of violence, but of adjustment. Not forgery exactly, for that required ambition, but manipulation through omission. He made a quiet note in his ledger. Then he picked up the telephone and dialed a number written in faded ink on the inside of a folder. "Mr. Brimley?" he asked. "Inspector Purbright here. I'd be grateful if we could have a brief word about allotments, amended motions, and the curious timing of typewritten memos." The old voice on the line was dry, but willing. "I rather thought you might call," Brimley said. The next morning broke with a frigid drizzle that coated the iron railings of Flaxborough in a thin, indecisive sheen. In the police station, Inspector Purbright stood in front of the small wallboard reserved for his neatest mind maps, staring quietly at the cluster of names and dates he'd placed like chessmen around a council-shaped battlefield. Brimley had, in his way, confirmed what Purbright had already begun to suspect. The vanished clause in Miss Pugh's minutes had directly impacted the reassignment of several key allotment plots. Specifically, 3 in a row on Sandmill Lane, which had recently been leased not to retiring gardeners, but to a private construction concern connected, via layers of polite obfuscation, to Councillor Lembridge's second cousin's accounting firm. Nothing illegal, Brimley had said mildly, but the sort of thing that would make the council chambers very drafty indeed, if someone left the door open. Love entered with a file in hand and a slight frown. "Got statements from Miss Rudge and Mrs. Finch," he announced, laying them down. "Rudge insists she found the missing page in the vestry box, wrapped in last year's newsletter and some twine. Says she wasn't looking for anything, just checking for leftover hymnals. And Mrs. Finch? She says she was told where to look. An anonymous note was pushed under her potting shed door. Rather damp, typed. No fingerprints, of course." Purbright nodded, eyes still on the board. "The same type as the note sent to Miss Spragg. Same uneven spacing, same dodgy ribbon. Someone's got a stubborn old Underwood. And they're using it to spread breadcrumbs." Love raised an eyebrow. "Trying to help? Or trying to distract?" Purbright murmured. "Help in Flaxborough rarely arrives without a side order of motive." At midday, Purbright made a quiet visit to the municipal allotment registry, where he requested a file that had to be retrieved from a back cupboard guarded by a morose clerk and a kettle older than most of the rhubarb in town. In the file, original lease applications, renewal stamps, and the minutes from a subcommittee vote, which bore, in faded blue ink, the faint traces of the removed clause. That clause, it now became clear, had specified that any reallocation of plots should be reviewed in open session, with notice given to existing applicants. Without it, reassignments could be handled at the committee chair's discretion. Lembridge had been that chair. "Conveniently forgetful," Purbright muttered. Returning to the station, he found Love waiting with a bemused look. "You'll want to hear this, sir. Miss Rudge just rang. Said there's been an incident. At the hall. The Methodist Hall." "No, sir. The town hall. Apparently, a curtain collapsed in the council chamber." "Collapsed?" "More accurately, it was pulled down. Deliberately." At the town hall, the scene bore a certain theatrical quality. A heavy red curtain, once looped neatly beside the tall south window, now lay in a heap upon the floor like a slain aristocrat. Behind it, dusty wall panels and, more pertinently, a small recess had been revealed. Within the recess, a faded canvas briefcase, and in the briefcase, more documents than anyone could reasonably be expected to read in one sitting. Miss Rudge stood nearby with arms folded and a calm expression that hinted she had known all along it would come to this. "I didn't do it," she said. "But I knew it would happen eventually. Secrets in Flaxborough don't stay hidden. They just wait for their turn." Inside the briefcase, Purbright found more than he'd hoped for. Minutes annotated in Miss Pugh's distinctive purple ink. Several carbon copies of rejected motions, one with a handwritten note in the margin. Clarify motive for omission. Likely pressure from above. And, folded carefully, a letter addressed to whomever it may concern. In it, Miss Pugh outlined, with quiet precision, a timeline of minor procedural discrepancies and larger shifts in voting patterns. Her tone was not accusatory but observant, a catalogue of patterns seen only by someone who knew the records intimately. "She knew," Love said softly. "She didn't want revenge. She just wanted the truth to be available, like a footnote waiting for someone to read it." Purbright glanced down at the page, then up at the council chamber. Its chairs slightly askew, its air still tense with the residue of interrupted respectability. "Truth in Flaxborough," he said quietly, "has the unfortunate habit of arriving late and knocking over the furniture." That evening, Councillor Lembridge was invited to the station for a clarificatory conversation, a term that softened nothing. To his credit, Lembridge arrived punctually, dressed immaculately, and spent the first 10 minutes explaining how any discrepancy in the minutes was surely an administrative oversight. Purbright, sitting with his usual composure, laid out the documents slowly, one by one, like a magician revealing the cards had been marked all along. Lembridge's protests became increasingly tentative. He shifted in his chair. He dabbed at his temple. He began to mention pressure from certain donors and hinted that some motions had been altered in good faith. When Purbright asked whether he had known Miss Pugh had noticed, the councillor hesitated. Then, with an oddly genuine expression, he admitted, "Yes. And I hoped she wouldn't say anything." But she did. Not publicly, that was her way. Dignity above confrontation. Purbright let the silence hang for a moment before replying, "Perhaps. But she gave us everything we needed." As Lembridge was escorted from the interview room, the station seemed to exhale, not in triumph, but in recognition that the tangled, quiet threads of the past weeks had finally been gathered. Later, as dusk fell over Flaxborough and the street lamps blinked themselves into weary service, Purbright sat at his desk and opened a file marked Parish Irregularities Pending. He drew a neat line through the title. Outside, the rain had begun again, softly, as if the town itself had decided that things ought to return to normal, at least for now. Inspector Purbright arrived at the civic luncheon precisely 20 minutes after the first vol au vent had been nervously pecked by Councillor Glossop. The function, hastily repurposed from a post-economic regeneration strategy briefing into what the mayor had euphemistically called an informal reconciliation gathering, was held in the upstairs ballroom of the Flaxborough Liberal Club, where the ceiling threatened plaster perils and the tea-urn hissed with quiet fury. Purbright moved with his usual understated grace, nodding to aldermen and civil volunteers alike, his presence unobtrusive yet oddly magnetic. He had not come to arrest anyone, not today, nor to deliver a public statement, though a few nervously repositioned their sandwiches upon seeing him. Rather, it was the final scene he had always known was required, not in a courtroom, but among the culprit's peers and witnesses, where embarrassment was punishment enough and silence served as the full stop. Near the refreshment table, Councillor Lembridge stood with an air of reluctant penitence, engaged in brittle pleasantries with Miss Rudge, who, having recently added acting secretary pro tem to her church newsletter sign-off, carried herself with almost regal calm. Lembridge had not been formally charged, not yet, but he had been asked to temporarily step aside from all committee duties, and the phrase hung over his lapel like a velvet noose. "I suppose," Miss Rudge was saying with an arch upward glance, "the minutes from today's luncheon will be thoroughly recorded?" Lembridge managed a wincing smile, the kind a man uses when standing on splinters. Purbright drifted past and took his place beside Mrs. Glossop, who had come, ostensibly, in support of her husband, but had brought along 2 acquaintances from the Ladies' Reading Guild, and a cutting from last week's County Watchman that suggested the allotment scandal might spread to the Fencing Permit Committee. "Have you noticed," she murmured, "how many people are suddenly interested in parish documentation? We're nearly out of cream scones." "I find," said Purbright, "that controversy tends to stimulate the appetite for jam and for justification." Elsewhere in the room, Sergeant Love stood chatting amiably with Reverend Spink, who had taken it upon himself to pronounce the entire affair a lesson in spiritual humility, though he had yet to explain what humility looked like when disguised as a construction bid for public land. It was only later, once the teacups had been emptied, and the community theater treasurer began quietly gathering leftover serviettes for reuse, that Purbright addressed the room. Not formally, no lectern, no announcement, but with a tone of mild observation that somehow made the entire chamber turn its collective head. "You will all be relieved to know," he said with the faintest smile, "that the matter of the missing clause has been resolved. Miss Pugh, though she did not live to see it, ensured her conscience, and the council's, was not denied its final entry. We now understand how a well-timed omission allowed for a redirection of allotment plots and how those redirections were quietly profitable." The word profitable hovered for a moment, its implications settling into the carpet like biscuit crumbs. "There will be," he continued, "no arrests at present, but there will be letters, reports, committees." Someone near the window coughed. "More importantly," he added, "there will be memories. And minutes. And I imagine, for a while, a little more caution when crossing out what was meant to remain recorded." And with that, he bowed slightly and returned to his tea, as though he had merely offered a recipe recommendation. By the following week, the town had absorbed the scandal with its usual blend of propriety and ingenuity. A new petition circulated calling for the digitization of all council minutes, led curiously by Mr. Pym, the printer, who had finally discovered a profitable reason to advocate for municipal transparency. Miss Spragg returned to her column with renewed vigor, producing a 2-part editorial titled "Justice in Italics," how a missing page spoke louder than speeches. Councillor Lembridge tendered his resignation with the word "distraction" used 6 times, and his cousin's accounting firm quietly dissolved. No public apology was issued. But then, in Flaxborough, apologies were considered gauche unless printed under wedding announcements. As for Purbright, he resumed his routines with quiet satisfaction. He did not linger over his notes. He made no speeches in closed rooms. He simply filed the case under a drawer labeled "Administrative Peculiarities," locked it, and made tea. Late one afternoon, with the rain politely tapping at his office window, he opened a letter marked with a purple ribbon. It was from the executor of Miss Pugh's modest estate, and contained a brief personal note she had left behind, written in her careful looping hand. "If conscience is a lonely duty, then let it at least be recorded." Purbright folded it, smiled gently, and reached for his pen.